It was 1998, and I was driving my truck, pulling a fifth-wheel RV along a stretch of highway just outside of Kayenta, Arizona. The road was quiet, with only a few other vehicles passing now and then. This was the infamous Route 666, the Devil's Highway, as some called it. The government had already renamed it Highway 491, but most locals still called it by the old number. I never paid much attention to the stories about this road, but that evening, I would find out why it had such a sinister reputation. I was traveling with my wife, Sarah, and our infant son, Ethan. We had just started a long road trip to visit her family in Colorado, something we'd been planning for months. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate desert landscape. The temperature had dropped, but it was still warm enough to feel the heat radiating off the asphalt. Somewhere around 20 miles outside of town, I felt the truck lurch slightly. A thudding sound followed, and I instinctively pulled over onto the narrow shoulder of the road. Sure enough, the trailer had a flat tire. I cursed under my breath and climbed out of the truck to take a look. The desert was quiet, eerily so. No birds, no wind, just the sound of the truck cooling down and my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked to the trailer. Sarah stayed in the truck with Ethan, and I could see her in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back to check on him. I grabbed my tools and the spare tire from the storage compartment under the RV and got to work. Changing a flat on the side of the road isn't fun, but it's not the end of the world either. Still, something about the silence around me felt oppressive. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on the task at hand. As I worked, I noticed headlights approaching in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a highway after all. But as the vehicle got closer, it began to slow down. My pulse quickened when it pulled over and stopped about 20 feet behind my truck. A man got out. He was tall and wiry, dressed in dirty jeans and a tattered flannel shirt. His hair was unkempt, and there was something in the way he moved that immediately set me on edge. I've always trusted my gut, and my gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. He started walking toward me. His movements were slow but deliberate, like he was trying to appear casual. I straightened up and turned to face him, keeping my distance. My right hand rested near my hip, where I carried my sidearm in a holster. I didn't draw it, but I wanted to be ready if things went south. He stopped a few feet away and started talking, but I wasn't paying attention to his words. All I could focus on was the way his eyes darted around, like he was sizing me up, or maybe the truck and RV. My gut told me this guy wasn't here to help. I shook my head firmly and waved him off, letting him know I didn't need his help. He hesitated for a moment, then took another step forward. That was it. I drew my pistol and held it low, pointing at the ground but ready to raise it if I had to. My posture must have gotten the message across because he stopped in his tracks. For a few tense seconds, neither of us moved. Then he slowly raised his hands and backed away, muttering something I couldn't hear. He got back into his truck, slammed the door, and drove off. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I holstered my weapon but kept my eyes on the road, just in case he decided to come back. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, and my hands shook as I picked up the lug wrench to finish changing the tire. I had just started working again when I saw flashing lights in the distance. 2 police cars sped toward me, their sirens off but their lights cutting through the twilight. They pulled up alongside my truck, and 2 officers got out. Both were Navajo Nation police, judging by their uniforms. One of them approached me while the other stayed back, scanning the area. The officer asked me if I'd seen a man in a truck matching the description of the one that had just left. I pointed in the direction he had gone and told them everything I could. They thanked me and sped off, their tires kicking up dust as they disappeared into the growing darkness. I stood there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The whole encounter left me shaken in a way I hadn't felt in years. I'd spent 6 years in the Army working in hazardous environments, chemical spills, explosive ordnance, you name it. But nothing had ever made me feel as vulnerable as I did in that moment on the side of the road. It took me over an hour to finish changing the tire. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, and every little noise made me jump. When I finally climbed back into the truck, Sarah asked me what had taken so long. I didn't have the words to explain it, so I just muttered something about being extra careful. We drove the rest of the way in silence. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that truck again or the flashing lights of the police cars. But the road stayed empty, and we eventually made it to a small motel in town. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the faint sounds of traffic outside. My mind kept replaying the events of the evening, the man's eyes, the way he moved, the officer's urgency. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't been armed, things might have ended very differently. Even now, years later, I can't drive past that stretch of highway without feeling a knot in my stomach. The desert has a way of holding onto its secrets, and I'll never forget the one it almost kept that night. I booked a camping trip for my friend Jake and me in early October. We'd found a spot in southern Wyoming through a website called Backwoods Escapes. Neither of us had used the site before, but the reviews were good. The campsite was advertised as remote, nestled in a dense patch of pines about 20 minutes off a dirt road, with no nearby neighbors. It sounded perfect for a quiet weekend getaway, just the kind of escape we both needed. I call myself a somewhat experienced camper, though I only managed to get out a few times a year. Jake was newer to it, but he'd been eager to join me and try something different. We packed light but prepared, a sturdy tent, a small propane stove, sleeping bags rated for cold weather, and plenty of snacks. The site came with a fire pit and a basic shelter in case the weather turned bad. We arrived Friday afternoon, and everything seemed ideal. The campsite was as secluded as advertised. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines gave us just enough space to set up camp without feeling exposed. The weather was crisp, with the kind of cool breeze that hinted at the coming winter but wasn't uncomfortable yet. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. We didn't see any wildlife except for a few chipmunks that darted through the underbrush, and we definitely didn't see any moose, though the owner had warned us they occasionally wandered through the area. We kept the fire low at night, just enough to warm ourselves, and doused it thoroughly before heading to bed. On the 3rd night, I found myself wide awake. Jake was snoring softly beside me, cocooned in his sleeping bag. The tent was warm and secure, but I couldn't seem to settle. I stared up at the nylon ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside. The night was calm, almost too calm. The usual sounds of nature, the breeze in the trees, the occasional skitter of a chipmunk, seemed distant. I couldn't place why, but something felt off. Then I heard it. It started as a faint crunching sound, like someone or something walking through the dry pine needles just beyond the tent. The steps were deliberate, heavy enough to suggest size, but not hurried. They came from my side of the tent and moved slowly toward the center of the campsite. At first, I thought it might finally be a moose. The owner's warnings flashed through my mind, and I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would lose interest and move on. I held my breath, listening as the steps came to a stop. Then, everything went quiet, not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, no scurrying chipmunks, just silence. My pulse quickened. Silence in the wild often means a predator is near, but this didn't feel like an animal. I stared at the zipper of the tent door, willing my eyes to see through it, though I knew that was impossible. The opaque fabric blocked any view of the outside. My heart was pounding, and I strained to hear something, anything, that might give me a clue about what was out there. And then the lights started. They weren't bright at first, just faint flickers that danced across the fabric of the tent. I froze, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Couldn't be headlights. The dirt road was too far away, and the angle was all wrong. Maybe it was someone with a flashlight? But why would anyone be out here in the middle of the night? The flickers became more pronounced, erratic, like someone was waving a light around just outside. They only hit one side of the tent, the side with the door. I glanced at the small mesh window on the back of the tent, but there were no lights shining through the trees. My mind raced. Could it be other campers? Maybe they were lost and wandered into our sight by accident. But why wouldn't they call out? Why would they be silent? The lights continued for about 45 seconds, though it felt much longer. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was terrified that if I made the slightest noise, whatever was outside would notice me. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the lights stopped. I stayed frozen, listening intently for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No footsteps retreating into the woods. No sound of a vehicle driving away. Just silence. I didn't dare move for the rest of the night. Every sound, no matter how faint, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I felt like a hunted animal, trapped in the flimsy safety of my tent. When morning finally came, the light streaming through the tent felt like salvation. I nudged Jake awake, and we cautiously unzipped the tent door. The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it. There were no tracks in the dirt, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. We packed up quickly, neither of us saying much. I didn't tell Jake about the lights. What was I supposed to say? That I saw strange, silent flashes of light in the middle of the night? That I thought someone, or something, was out there watching us? Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened. I've gone over every possibility in my head. Headlights, flashlights, lightning, even some kind of electrical phenomenon. But none of it adds up. I still have the video I took on my phone. It's grainy and barely shows anything unless you crank up the exposure. The flashes are there, faint but unmistakable. I've replayed that night in my head over and over, and the one thing I can't shake is the silence. Whatever it was, it didn't leave the way it came, and that's what scares me the most. It was late June of 2019 when I took my 3 kids camping in a state park nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. We had been planning the trip for weeks, packing up tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and everything else we'd need for a weekend in the wilderness. My kids, Andrew, 13, Emily, 10, and Jacob, 7, were thrilled. They loved the idea of spending a few days away from the usual routine, out where they could explore and feel a bit wild. I felt good about it too. The park had well-maintained trails, a clean bathhouse, and a ranger station not too far from the campsite. Felt safe. We arrived early Friday afternoon. The campground was busy but not overcrowded, with a mix of families, couples, and solo campers setting up their spots. Our site was tucked toward the back of the loop, close to a cluster of tall oaks and maples that provided shade and a sense of seclusion. A narrow dirt trail connected the campsite to the bathhouse, cutting through the woods for about 100 yards. I made sure to go over some basic rules with the kids. Stay together, don't wander too far from the site, and always let me know where you're going. Once we had the tents set up and a fire going, the kids were eager to explore. They were fascinated by the dense forest that surrounded the campground. The trees were tall and thick, their branches creating a canopy that let in only specks of sunlight. Every so often, I'd hear them laughing or calling out to one another as they poked around the undergrowth, discovering wildflowers, strange bugs, and the occasional animal track. By evening, we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the fire. The kids were still buzzing with excitement, recounting everything they'd seen. Emily told me about a hollow log she found that looked like something a fox might live in. Andrew claimed to have spotted a deer through the trees, though Emily was quick to question him. Jacob just liked digging in the dirt, collecting rocks and sticks he thought looked interesting. That first night was uneventful. We all slept soundly, tired from the day's adventures. The next morning, the kids were up early, ready to explore more of the forest. After breakfast, I let them head out again, reminding them to stick to the buddy system if they needed to use the bathroom. Andrew and Emily paired up, leaving Jacob with me at the campsite. The day passed quickly. The kids came and went, each time bringing back some new story or treasure they'd found in the woods. Around mid-afternoon, a park ranger stopped by our site while making his rounds. He mentioned that it was rattlesnake season and that we should be careful, especially near rocky areas or tall grass. The warning gave me pause, but I figured the kids were staying close enough to the main trails to avoid any real danger. I repeated the ranger's advice to them and made sure they understood to watch their step. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, the mood was a little quieter. The kids were tired, their earlier excitement tempered by the thought of snakes hiding somewhere out in the darkness. I didn't want them to worry too much, so I reassured them that we'd be fine if we stayed alert. We all went to bed early that night, the forest around us alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. The next morning, everything seemed normal at first. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow through the trees. I started making coffee while the kids stirred awake in their sleeping bags. Then, a couple from a nearby campsite stopped by. Their expressions were serious, and they spoke in hushed tones as they told me what had happened during the night. Apparently, a woman camping further down the loop had been bitten by a rattlesnake while walking the trail to the bathhouse. The bite was bad enough that she had to be rushed to the hospital. The rangers believed the snake had been hidden near the edge of the trail, where the dirt path met a patch of tall grass. It struck without warning. Hearing this sent a chill through me. That was the same trail my kids had been using. The thought of one of them encountering a snake like that made my stomach churn. I looked at their sleepy faces, grateful they hadn't been harmed, but the sense of unease lingered. I decided we'd pack up and head home later that day. The idea of staying another night, knowing how many snakes were out there, didn't sit right with me. I told the kids about the woman and reminded them again to be careful where they stepped. As we started breaking down the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something awful. The ranger's warning from the day before replayed in my mind, his casual mention of rattlesnake season now taking on a more ominous tone. By mid-morning, we were packed up and ready to leave. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the trees receding into the distance. The forest had seemed so inviting just 2 days earlier, but now it felt like a place I didn't fully understand. A place that could turn dangerous in an instant. Back at home, I did some reading about rattlesnakes and their behavior during breeding season. I learned they're more active, more likely to be near trails or open areas as they search for mates. The thought of how easily one could have been lying in wait along the trail kept me up that night. Even now, I can't help but think about how close we were to a very different outcome. The kids remember the trip fondly, the details of the rattlesnake incident fading in their minds over time. But for me, it was a stark reminder of how unpredictable nature can be, and how lucky we were to walk away unscathed. The trees stretched high above us, their branches creaking as the wind passed through. I remember how the sound seemed to get louder as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon. My father, a cop for over 20 years, was a man of few words, but when it came to the outdoors, he was more than prepared. I was 17 at the time, not really a fan of camping but always tagging along when he insisted. We were about 2 hours into the woods, in a secluded area not far from where my father had worked a case years before. The location was so far out that cell service didn't exist, a perfect spot to disconnect from the world, or so we thought. The campsite was simple enough. Dad had set up a tent, a fire pit, and a few chairs around the glowing fire. It wasn't particularly cold, but the forest felt unnervingly quiet, like something was watching us. Dad didn't seem to mind the silence. It was the type of stillness that he probably found peaceful. But for me, it felt wrong. We had just finished dinner, a simple meal of canned chili and beans, when I started to hear something. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, like footsteps on dry leaves. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but the noise didn't stop. It moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, almost like someone was circling the camp. My eyes darted to my father, but he didn't react. He was poking at the fire, his face lit by the flickering flames. I stood up, scanning the tree line, trying to make sense of the sound. That's when I noticed it, the shape of something moving just outside the reach of the firelight. It was quick, too quick to be a deer. My heart began to race. "Dad," I whispered, but he didn't answer. I took a step closer to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad, there's something out there." He slowly turned to face me, his eyes sharp despite the years. He was a cop, used to handling tense situations, but even he seemed to pause before responding. "It's probably just an animal," he said, his voice low and steady, though I could sense the slight tension in his words. But the noise kept getting closer. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My dad stood up, his hand moving toward the small handgun he kept in his waistband. I never thought I'd see him use it, but that night, something felt different. We both moved toward the edge of the campsite, the firelight flickering behind us, casting long, eerie shadows in the woods. The steps came again, closer now, almost directly behind the tree line. My pulse thudded in my ears as my father held up a hand, signaling me to stay quiet. There was a rustle from the underbrush, and then, out of nowhere, a man stepped into the clearing. He wasn't armed, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. His clothes were torn, and his face was dirty, covered in mud and sweat. His eyes locked onto ours, and I could see a wild desperation in them. I got lost," he said, his voice ragged. "Please, I need help." My father didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, his hand still on the grip of his gun. "You're miles from any trail," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing out here?" The man stumbled forward, his eyes darting between us, his body trembling. "I wasn't supposed to be out here," he muttered, almost to himself. "They're looking for me. You need to get out before it's too late." At that, something clicked in my father's mind. He wasn't just a cop. He was trained to spot a lie, to read people. The man's nervousness was palpable, and I could tell he was hiding something. My father's grip on his gun tightened. "Who's looking for you?" My father's tone was sharp now, and I could see the caution in his eyes. The man's gaze shifted nervously around the woods, like he was expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees. The people I ran from," he said in a low, almost frantic voice. "They won't stop until they find me." My father's instincts kicked in. He motioned for me to stay back, and I stepped away, feeling a strange mix of fear and curiosity. The man's story didn't add up, but I couldn't figure out why. Suddenly, the man broke into a run, darting off into the woods with surprising speed. My father immediately followed, but the woods were dense, and it was hard to keep up. I stayed behind, my heart racing as I listened to the sounds of the chase fading into the night. It didn't take long for my father to return, his face grim. He didn't say a word as he walked back to the campsite, but I could tell he wasn't shaken. He was focused. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. There was no explanation, no reasoning with him. It was clear from the look in his eyes that something was terribly wrong. We packed up quickly, moving with precision, and I didn't question him. Something in my gut told me that leaving was the right decision. But as we loaded the last of our gear into the truck, I glanced back at the dark woods, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees. As we drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror. The lights from our truck cut through the darkness, but in the distance, the woods swallowed the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone, or something, was still out there, watching us. Hours passed before we reached a nearby town, my father's silence only broken by the sound of the tires on the road. I didn't ask about what happened. He didn't need to say anything. His instincts were sharper than mine, and I trusted him. As we pulled into a gas station to refuel, a police cruiser pulled in behind us. It was a local officer, and my father nodded at him briefly before turning back to me. "They found the body," my father said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That man wasn't lost. He was running from something, and he was dangerous." The officer confirmed the story, though I could tell he didn't want to say much more. We didn't stick around long after that. As we drove away from the town, the weight of the night settled in. The man, whatever he was running from, was still out there, and we had barely escaped. The woods, it seemed, weren't as empty as they seemed, and the things that hide in the shadows aren't always as easy to spot. The rain hadn't let up for hours. Heavy drops beat down relentlessly on the roof of our small camping tent, the sound like a constant hammer against the fabric. My wife, Emily, and I had decided to escape the noise of the city for a weekend, heading out to the woods near Elk Creek for a quiet camping trip. We were both in our late 30s, and though we'd done a fair amount of camping in the past, we never had a storm like this roll through. The weather had been fine when we arrived at the site, but as dusk settled, the sky darkened, and a cold wind blew in from the north. The forecast had said light rain, but by now, it was clear that the storm was much stronger than expected. Emily had built a fire just before the rain started, but it didn't last long. The wood was too damp, and the flames quickly died. We settled into the tent, hoping the storm would pass soon. Inside the tent, the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, the kind of scent that always made me think of being in nature. The storm made the night feel eerie, though. The wind howled through the trees, sending branches creaking and groaning. Every so often, a sharp crack echoed in the distance, and I couldn't help but wonder what it was. Tree limbs breaking under the weight of the rain, or something else. I glanced over at Emily, who was lying on her side, facing away from me. Her breath was steady, but I could tell she was awake, listening to the storm too. We'd been in quiet campsites before, but there was something different about this place. Maybe it was the remoteness. There were no other campers nearby, and the woods around us were thick and wild. Even with the rain, the night felt suffocating, like the trees were closing in around us. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable footsteps crunching through the wet leaves outside the tent. My heart rate sped up as I froze, trying to make out the sound. At first, I thought it could be a deer or another animal moving through the forest, but the footsteps didn't have the rhythm of an animal. They were too deliberate, too steady. Someone or something was out there. I motioned for Emily to stay still and reached for the flashlight beside me. The beam flicked on, cutting through the dimness of the tent. I unzipped the flap just enough to peer outside. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring everything. I could barely make out shapes in the darkness. The forest, usually so full of life, was now eerily still. The only sound was the storm and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. There was no sign of anyone, but the feeling didn't leave me. Whoever, whatever, had been walking outside had been close. Too close. I didn't say anything to Emily. She didn't need to be worried, and I wasn't sure what I'd seen. Maybe it had just been an animal, after all. Maybe the wind had made it sound more like footsteps than it really was. But the feeling lingered, the kind of feeling that prickled at the back of your neck, urging you to pay attention, to be aware. I lay back down and tried to push the thought from my mind. Emily turned over, now facing me. The tent was quiet again, except for the rain. I could feel the weight of the silence between us. Minutes passed, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing the noise in my head, over and over, the crunching of footsteps in the wet leaves. Then the flash of something moving outside. I was beginning to drift off when I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. My stomach dropped, and I sat up in a flash. Emily stirred, sensing my sudden tension. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, even though I knew she had. She nodded, her eyes wide in the dim light of the tent. "It's too quiet now. I don't like it." I didn't like it either. The noise wasn't natural. It was too deliberate, like someone was pacing around our campsite. I didn't want to be the one to go outside and check, but I had to know what it was. I grabbed the flashlight again and unzipped the tent flap. The rain had slowed slightly, but the air was thick and heavy with moisture. I stepped out into the soggy ground, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I scanned the area, my breath shallow. There was nothing in sight, just wet trees and soggy underbrush. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stepped further out, moving cautiously. My boots squelched in the mud with each step, and the rain splattered on my shoulders. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the sense of being followed. My eyes darted between the trees, looking for movement. Nothing. But just as I was about to turn back, a loud crack echoed from behind me. My body tensed, and I spun around, raising the flashlight high, my pulse racing. The beam swept over the trees, but again, nothing. The woods were silent except for the rain. It was as if the sound had come from inside my head. I stood there for a moment, listening, my ears strained for anything out of the ordinary. The trees were still. No wind, no animals, just the steady rhythm of rain hitting the ground. I made my way back to the tent, my steps quicker now. The sensation of being watched hadn't left me. Emily was sitting up inside the tent, her face pale, her eyes locked on me. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said. I wasn't sure what I was even thinking. I couldn't explain the feeling, but I knew something wasn't right. "Let's just stay in here for now." We huddled together in the tent, the rain drumming louder on the canvas above us. The storm seemed to be growing stronger again. The wind howled through the trees, the branches groaning under its force. Then I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. Footsteps, crunching through the wet leaves, moving closer to our tent. I felt my heart jump into my throat. Whoever or whatever was out there was right outside. This wasn't an animal anymore. It was a person. My breath quickened, and I motioned for Emily to stay quiet. I grabbed the flashlight and held it tightly, preparing to turn it on. The footsteps stopped suddenly. I stood still, waiting for any sign of movement. Then, a deep, guttural sound broke the silence. A low growl, almost like a warning. My stomach twisted with fear. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but the sound felt wrong. No animal made a noise like that. It was something far worse. The air around us seemed to grow colder, heavier, the storm making everything feel even more suffocating. I wanted to run, but my body felt frozen. The growl sounded again, this time much closer. It felt like it was coming from just behind the tent. I swallowed hard. There was nothing we could do now. We were trapped. Suddenly, the growl stopped, and I heard a rustling in the bushes. Then, as quickly as it had started, the footsteps were gone. The silence returned, only broken by the rain and the wind. Emily and I stayed still, not daring to make a sound. We waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to unzip the flap just a little, scanning the area once more. The woods were dark and silent. There was no sign of anything or anyone. I slowly exhaled. Maybe it had just been a bear or some other wild animal, I thought. But the growl, the footsteps, it didn't make sense. We decided to pack up in the morning, no matter how the storm turned out. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. I wouldn't feel safe until we were out of those woods. We lay there in the dark, listening to the rain, the terror still gripping me tight. The storm wasn't the only thing keeping me awake. The next morning, we broke camp quickly and silently, packing our gear into the car. There was no sign of anything strange from the night before, no tracks, no evidence. But as I looked around one last time before we drove away, something in the trees caught my eye. A shape, barely noticeable, blending into the shadows. It was still watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone in the woods. Something had been out there with us, and it wasn't going to let us forget it. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, though it feels like a lifetime ago. I was in my mid-20s, looking for a break from everything, so I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd been to the woods plenty of times before, but never alone, and never in the colder months. The wilderness of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado was my destination, a place known for its rugged terrain, harsh weather, and isolation. It was late October, the kind of time when the days start getting shorter, and the chill in the air creeps in faster than you can prepare for. I had a basic plan: set up camp, hike during the day, and relax by the fire at night. Nothing too elaborate. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wanted peace, time away from my job, and a break from the noise of the city. I packed my gear into my car, a sturdy SUV with plenty of room for my camping supplies. I made sure to bring my tent, sleeping bag, a couple of days' worth of food, and, of course, a map. I wasn't trying to get lost, but it's always good to have a backup. The road leading to the trailhead was narrow, winding through dense forest. I passed a few other cars on the way, all heading in the opposite direction, and after a while it felt like I was the only one left. The sun began to dip behind the mountains as I reached the trailhead, the trees casting long shadows over the dirt road. The air was biting, and I could see my breath in the fading light. I didn't mind the cold. It made the experience feel real, like I was truly out in the wild. I set up camp just before it got completely dark. My tent went up quickly, and I gathered some firewood from the area nearby. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck in the dark without a fire. As I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, I felt a strange kind of peace. The cold night air was sharp against my face, but the warmth from the fire made it bearable. It was the kind of quiet that makes you think about everything and nothing all at once. That night, the sound of the wind howling through the trees made it hard to sleep. It wasn't unusual for mountain weather to turn, but something about it felt different. The wind seemed to move in strange bursts, like it was being funneled through the narrow gaps between the trees. I tried to shake off the unease and closed my eyes, telling myself that it was just the wilderness doing its thing. When I woke up the next morning, the sky was overcast, and the air was colder than before. I packed up quickly, deciding to start my hike. The trail was well marked, leading up the mountain to a viewpoint I had wanted to see. As I hiked, the landscape changed around me. The trees became more sparse, and the ground beneath my boots started to turn rocky. There was a certain eerie stillness to the place, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, not a single soul. It felt like I was the only person left on Earth. The hike took longer than I had expected. The higher I climbed, the more the weather began to shift. By noon, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped rapidly. It wasn't just the cold. It was a bone-deep chill that seeped through every layer of clothing I had on. I stopped for a quick break, pulling my jacket tighter around me. My fingers were numb as I unwrapped a granola bar. That's when I noticed it. Something was off. There was a strange sound in the distance, like something was moving in the trees. It didn't sound like an animal, but more like something shifting through the underbrush, heavy footsteps following the contours of the land. I froze, holding my breath. I thought I had imagined it at first, but then the sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. It sounded like multiple pairs of feet moving in unison, but I saw nothing. I grabbed my backpack and stood up quickly, heart racing. My eyes darted through the trees, looking for anything out of the ordinary. There was nothing. The trail was empty, the trees still, the silence almost deafening. I told myself it was just wildlife, deer maybe, or a mountain lion. It's not uncommon for animals to move through the woods without making much sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I continued on, trying to push the uneasy feeling from my mind. The wind howled louder now, pushing against me with every step, like the mountain itself was trying to stop me from reaching the top. I kept walking, my boots crunching against the frozen earth. But the further I went, the more my senses were on edge. The path seemed to narrow, the trees growing closer together as if they were closing in around me. The air felt heavier, thicker, and I realized with a sudden jolt of fear that the temperature had dropped even further. It was too cold now, too cold for late October. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. But this time I didn't hesitate. I spun around, eyes scanning the trail. Nothing. The trees were empty, the trail as desolate as before. But there was no mistaking it now. Something was out there. Something was following me. I hurried down the path, my breath quickening as panic started to rise in my chest. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, but the sensation of being watched was unbearable. The footsteps continued, echoing in my mind, even though I couldn't see a single person. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It felt like someone or something was close behind me, moving with purpose, matching my pace. I was no longer alone. I reached the clearing where I had planned to rest, but I didn't stop. Instead, I kept walking, faster now, ignoring the burning in my legs. The temperature was freezing now, the air so cold it stung my lungs with every breath. The path twisted ahead, and I thought I saw a figure. Tall, dark, and moving quickly through the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I must have been imagining it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled back to my camp. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I had no idea what had followed me, but I knew one thing. It wasn't an animal. There was something out there, something watching, something that knew I was alone. I wasted no time. I grabbed my things and packed up as quickly as I could, my movements erratic, the panic threatening to overwhelm me. I didn't even care about the firewood or the food I'd brought with me. All I cared about was leaving. I drove back down the mountain in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road seemed endless, twisting through the darkening forest. I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, where the trees started to thin, I breathed a sigh of relief. The sound of the wind died down, and the chill in the air lessened. I wasn't entirely sure what had happened up there, But I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be returning to those mountains anytime soon. The wilderness, once so inviting, now felt like something I could never understand. It wasn't just the isolation that scared me. It was the feeling of being watched, of knowing something was out there in the woods, just beyond sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I'd never felt that kind of fear before, the kind that clung to your bones and didn't let go. And as I drove away, I realized that no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something had followed me up there. Something that knew I was alone and would have done anything to keep me there. I don't go camping alone anymore, and every time I think back to that night, to the cold, quiet woods, I can't help but feel like the mountain still holds its secrets. Secrets that I was never meant to uncover. It was supposed to be a routine weekend, just a few days in the woods for some quiet camping. I'd been in the army long enough to know how to survive out there. Could make a fire, set up camp in my sleep, and handle anything nature threw my way. But something about this trip felt different from the moment I left base. The trip had started on a clear Friday afternoon. The year was 2021, and I had just wrapped up a tough training exercise. I wasn't expecting anything too intense, just some alone time to decompress. I had planned to drive up into the mountains, about 30 miles outside of a small town called Copper Ridge. It was a perfect spot, one I had been to several times before. The area was remote, not far from civilization, but isolated enough to feel like a real escape. I drove for hours, listening to the hum of my truck tires and watching the sun dip lower behind the peaks. The dense trees of the national forest surrounded me on both sides, their dark silhouettes against the fading light. I'd been to this same campsite before, so setting up camp was second nature. I parked my truck near a small clearing, close to the creek, and unloaded my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, a cooler of food, and my trusty MREs. It wasn't much, but I wasn't here to impress anyone. As night fell, I started the fire. The crackle of the dry wood and the faint scent of pine filled the air. There was something comforting about the fire's warmth, the way it illuminated the trees and cast long shadows. I sat there for a while, just staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. The stress of military life felt 1,000 miles away. But then, as the night deepened, I began to hear something, a faint rustling, almost like footsteps. I thought maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something larger, but the sound kept going, too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my side. I scanned the edge of the clearing, but saw nothing. The rustling stopped. I wasn't paranoid, but something felt off. I wasn't alone out here. There was no one else around. Not for miles, but I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The military part of me tried to reason it away. Maybe it was the wind, maybe a bear. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that I was just fooling myself. There was something or someone else out there. I decided to go to bed early, just to get some rest. My tent was a simple one-man setup, and as I zipped it shut, I felt the strange sensation of being enclosed, of being trapped. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the sounds of the forest, crickets, the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional call of an owl. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger as the night wore on. Around midnight, I woke up with a start. The fire outside had burned low, leaving the campsite cloaked in near total darkness. My heart was pounding, and I wasn't sure if I had heard something or if it was just a dream. I lay there in the dark, trying to calm my breathing. I was fine. There was nothing out there. But that primal part of me, the soldier part, told me to get up and check. I crawled out of my sleeping bag slowly, trying not to make a sound. I unzipped the tent and peered out into the clearing. The fire had almost burned out completely, leaving only glowing embers. The forest was eerily quiet. No sounds, no movement. I was about to step out when I heard it again, the rustling. It was closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I had no doubt now it wasn't just an animal. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it out into the trees. I expected to see nothing, but there, just at the edge of the beam, was something moving. My heart skipped a beat. It was a shadow, too large to be a deer, too human-like in its shape. But it was moving erratically, almost like it was avoiding the light. I held my breath, watching. The shadow paused, just out of reach of the light, and for a moment, I thought it had spotted me. But then, it darted into the trees, disappearing like a wisp of smoke. I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know what it was, who or what was out there. I grabbed my backpack, my knife, and my rifle, strapping them to my back. I made sure the flashlight was secure in my hand. Then, I stepped out into the dark. The cool night air hit me, sending a chill down my spine. I knew the forest well, but there was something about it tonight that felt unfamiliar, even hostile. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. I moved cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry underbrush. I followed the trail where I had seen the shadow. The rustling was gone, but the air felt thick with tension, as if the very forest was holding its breath. Every step I took seemed louder than the last, and the flashlight flickered in my grip. And then, I heard it again, the rustling, but this time it was in the distance, further into the trees. It was a rhythm now, almost like footsteps, but heavy, dragging. I couldn't tell if it was moving toward me or away, but the noise was getting louder, more pronounced. I moved faster, pushing through the brush, trying to pinpoint the source. My pulse was racing. Was it a person? A bear? Something else? I knew my training. Stay calm. Keep your distance. Don't take unnecessary risks. But everything about this felt wrong. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. I reached a clearing, the moonlight illuminating the ground in front of me. And there, in the middle of the clearing, was something that made my blood run cold. A campfire, abandoned but still smoldering. The area around it was disturbed, as though someone had been there recently. I approached cautiously, my flashlight sweeping over the ground. There were footprints, fresh ones. Boots, military style, and they were large. They led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the dark. I knew then that I wasn't the only one out here. Someone had been watching me, and whoever they weren't just wandering through the woods. They were hunting. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. Should I call it in? No phone signal out here. It was just me and the forest. The silence had returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, as if the whole forest was waiting. I decided to head back to camp, but not directly. I needed to get a better idea of what I was dealing with. I moved through the trees, staying low, listening. The night seemed to press in around me, the shadows growing deeper. Just as I was about to make my way back to my tent, I heard something, footsteps, soft but unmistakable. They were coming from behind me. I spun around, aiming my flashlight in the direction of the noise. There was nothing there, just trees and darkness. But I wasn't alone. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, always just out of view. I moved faster, heading back to the edge of the clearing where my tent was. I had to make it back to safety. But before I could reach my camp, the footsteps stopped. And then I heard a voice, but not a human voice. A guttural growl, low and menacing, like something not quite human, came from just ahead, just beyond the trees. I froze. It wasn't a bear, I knew that. It wasn't anything I had heard before. My instincts kicked in, and I dropped to the ground, pressing myself into the earth. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a heavy thudding sound. I held my breath, waiting. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hand gripping the knife at my side. The sound stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I slowly rose to my feet, moving silently back toward my camp, my eyes scanning the shadows. I reached the tent, and without hesitation, I grabbed my gear, packed it as quickly as I could, and made my way back to the truck. I couldn't explain it. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted, had never left me. I didn't know who or what it was that had followed me out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't sticking around to find out. The truck roared to life, and I sped out of the clearing, my hands gripping the wheel. As I left the forest behind, the strange feeling of being watched slowly faded, but I couldn't shake the fear that whatever had been in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I didn't go back to that campsite. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I knew it was something I didn't want to meet again.